Learning how to use an off-camera flash can revolutionize the way that you take portraits. But what happens when you're using an off-camera flash and your photos just don't look the same from shot to shot? It's really frustrating, but the reality is that it doesn't have to be. It's likely that there's one of 5 different things that could be happening that's causing your exposures to be different from shot to shot. And I'm gonna be very honest with you. Some of these things I didn't know about a few years ago, and I was shocked to figure them out. So in this video, I'm gonna go through those 5 things, and we're gonna make your portrait photography using flash even better. So let's get into the first thing that could be happening. The reason why your images are looking different from shot to shot is that you're not shooting in manual mode. Now, it's very common for people who are new to off-camera flash or who are natural light photographers. You're shooting in aperture priority, you're shooting in shutter speed or shutter priority, you're shooting in program mode. God forbid you're shooting in auto. But all of these modes are perfectly fine when you're shooting available light. But when you're shooting with off-camera flash, it's the last thing that you want to do, because just by the nature of the shooting mode that you're using on the camera, it could be, for example, if you're shooting aperture priority, that it's going to change the aperture from shot to shot. So your flash output could be the same, but your aperture settings are going to change the overall image and the overall exposure if it's changing from, say, f2.8 to f4, or f4 to f1.8. God forbid these adjustments happen when you're using those automatic modes. It is going to affect your exposure and the shots that you're getting. So my best advice is shoot in manual mode anytime that you're using off-camera flash. That is going to be the key to making sure that your exposure is the same from shot to shot. But that's only one of the 5 things. This next one, I didn't even know about until recently. Let's get into that one. So this next thing I didn't realize for a very long time, but your white balance could be throwing off your exposure. Now, the white balance could be coming from 2 different things. Obviously, your flash, it's gonna output, if it's a good flash, it's gonna have maybe 100 to 150 degrees Kelvin difference from one flash to the next. You're not gonna notice that too much in your images, but if you're using an inexpensive flash, and this is what makes the difference between like a $100 flash and a $5,000 or a $1,000 flash, is gonna be from image to image, from flash to flash, the white balance is supposed to stay the same, but you're gonna notice that if the white balance is different, your exposure is gonna change as well. I didn't know that for the longest time, and when you see it, it's the most frustrating thing. Now, these Westcott lights that I'm using, the FJ400, the difference in white balance from shot to shot is not that bad to where you would see that difference. But if you're shooting with something different, something inexpensive, you will probably notice it. The other issue is the white balance that your camera is seeing. So if you're shooting in auto white balance, let's say you're outdoors and you're shooting available light, it could be that if you have auto white balance on, one shot might be at 5,500 Kelvin, and all of a sudden the white balance, your meter is reading something different. Maybe a cloud comes out, car drives through your frame, something changes in the background that causes your white balance to be thrown off. If it's thrown off by several thousand Kelvin, it's going to adjust your exposure. So rather than talking about it, I'm gonna take 4 different photos right now of Katelyn. I'm gonna use different white balance settings, but I'm keeping the exposure, the camera settings, the output of the flash is gonna stay the same. The only variable is gonna be the white balance. I'm gonna manually adjust the Kelvin from the lowest Kelvin setting to the proper Kelvin to the warmest Kelvin setting. And I want to show you 4 different shots so that you can see what's happening to the exposure. I'm going to take this first shot here at 3,000 Kelvin. Now I'll adjust it up to 4,000. These flashes typically are somewhere around 5,500, so we'll go up to the proper white balance. So here's that. Let's go up, let's go crazy here. Let's go to 7,000 Kelvin. Okay, so we got 4 different shots. Let's take a look at them. All right, so this first shot here was taken at 3,000 Kelvin. We're gonna turn on our exposure warning here in Capture One, and essentially everything that you see here in red is overexposed. So you can see that our background is overexposed. We have some areas of the face that are overexposed. Also take note of the histogram here. So that's showing us what the exposure looks like. I'll click on the next image and notice how much less red there is on the background. So less of the background is overexposed, but we do still have a lot of overexposure on the background. But see what happened to Katelyn's face, right? We had spots in that first image where those areas are overexposed. And here, her face is exposed properly. We just went up 1,000 Kelvin, right? So we went from 3,000 to 4,000. This is 5,500. So you're gonna notice now the background is properly exposed. We have a few areas of overexposure on Katelyn's face. And then we went crazy. We went to 7,000 for our Kelvin. And now still the background is exposed properly, but we have more overexposure on Katelyn's face. So let's put all 4 of these side by side, just so that you'll see the point that I'm making, which is that based on the white balance that you have set on your camera, it's going to throw off the exposure. We have 4 images, the shutter speed, aperture, ISO was the same, the flash output was the same, she's standing in the same spot, nothing changed, but the white balance, but yet we have 4 different exposures. So you wanna make sure that from shot to shot that the white balance is not changing, because if it's changing by several thousand degrees, that's gonna be a problem. Best advice I could give you is go into your camera settings, make sure that your white balance is set to a manual white balance. And I would say set it to 5,500 Kelvin because that is typically what the light, your off-camera flash is putting out anyway. Set it to 5,500 Kelvin, your exposure is gonna stay the same so long as your white balance is not adjusting. So this is something I didn't realize before, but you could clearly see that as we're adjusting the white balance, all other things being the same, we're getting wildly different exposures. So dial in a manual white balance setting and avoid it altogether. So this next thing is something that you may not have thought of, but the exposure could change if your subject happens to move from the optimal shooting location. So I want to show you what this looks like. I'm going to take a photo of Katelyn, and this probably happens all the time, especially if you're shooting in a studio environment. You take a photo, maybe the makeup artist or hairstylist says, oh, let me make an adjustment to their hair or their makeup. They walk away. Your lights don't walk away. They stay in the same spot. Maybe if you're on a tripod, you're also in the same spot. But when they come back, they have to come to the exact same spot if you want to keep the exposure the same. If they move a little to the left, a little to the right, a little forward, a little backward, and the light doesn't move to that same ratio, you're gonna have a different exposure. So let me show you what that looks like. All right, so as an example here, these are 2 photos. One of them, she's standing in what I would say would be the best spot. Then she comes back and she's not standing in the same spot. You're gonna notice that the exposure is going to shift from one shot to the other. Even if she moves over a little bit, depending on where the light is hitting her, different parts of the face, different parts of her body might be exposed a little bit differently. Now, it's not too big of a deal because you could actually go in post-production, and if you're shooting in RAW, for example, I could go into this darker shot here, and I could actually just boost up the exposure and try to get it to match a little bit better to that first shot. But it is something that you have to work on in post-production. If you want to save yourself some trouble, put some tape on the ground. Once you get your lighting dialed in, that person needs to stay there and not move. That will keep the exposure the same from shot to shot. Another common reason that your exposures might be different from shot to shot when you're using an off-camera flash is that your flash doesn't have enough time to recycle its light. So if you're shooting very fast, let's say you're shooting high-speed continuous shots with a flash, it's gonna be that, or it's possible that your flash may not be giving you the same exposure every time because it doesn't have enough time to recharge its flash. Another thing that happens when you're shooting with an off-camera flash is that you might be shooting in TTL or through the lens metering. And if you're doing that, just by nature of the way the setting works, your exposures could be drastically different. Now, I'm using the Westcott system. It does offer TTL metering, which basically essentially works like an automatic flash. So depending on what the light meter is reading, your flash power is going to adjust based on whatever the conditions are. Most of the time, TTL works really great, but if you're taking, let's say 100 photos, it's possible that from one shot to the next, the TTL mode might meter differently from one shot to the next, and you might end up getting, let's say, a flash power of 7.6 for one shot, and then all of a sudden it goes to 6.0. Well, if it does that, your exposure is going to change. Your settings on your camera could be the same, everything else could be the same, they're standing in the same spot. You got that manual white balance dialed in, so you know about that already. But if you're shooting in TTL, just by nature of the way that that setting works, it's possible that your exposures could change from shot to shot. So what I personally would recommend, shoot in manual mode for your flash as well. It's perfectly fine for that first shot if you're trying to figure out what flash power should I be at. Take that first shot in TTL. Let's say if it tells you need to be at 6.0, go to manual mode, manually dial your flash to 6.0, and then start shooting. Your shots are not gonna change unless your environment changes, if they move farther away, closer, whatever it might be, but it should keep your exposure the same. If all other variables are the same, you should be good to go. These 5 things that I just shared in this video, I promise you, if you're having issues, 99% of the time, it's gonna be one of these 5 things that we talked about in this video. So hopefully that helped you out. And if you like to learn off-camera flash tips, then listen, if you're not subscribed, what are you waiting for? Hurry up, hit the subscribe button, like this video, share it with your friends. I promise you at some point in your photography career, you're probably gonna wanna learn how to use a flash and you're gonna run into these problems. So hopefully it helped out. Big thanks to Katelyn for joining me for this video. I'm gonna leave her information in the details of this video. Give her a follow, she's got great work. And listen, I've got this really cool video here on my channel that you probably didn't see. If you're looking to learn about off-camera flash, you don't wanna miss this video. There's a really funny cameo in the video as well. Not gonna give it away. Go check it out. I'll see you in that video.